Hey guys, how's it going? It's Krista and I'm glad you're here. I'll start off today with a piece of 110-pound white piece of cardstock and prepare that for embossing. I chose deliberately today to start with a piece of cardstock that's larger than an A2 card front, just because I don't know exactly where I want to cut the hill. I'm starting off with my sentiment today, and I chose Happy Birthday from Simon Says Stamp Let's Celebrate Stamp and Die Set. I'll find my placement on my cardstock. Although I don't know exactly where the sentiment will lay on my card, I do know that I want it to be near the bottom, and I'll pick it up with my stamping tool. I'll then come in with some Versamark ink and ink up my stamp. And close my stamping tool over. Over a coffee filter, I'll add some Ranger white embossing powder and set it with a heat tool. It doesn't look like much now, but as I begin to add my ink, the sentiment will reveal itself. I'll start off with Mode Lawn Distress ink, and I'm inking deliberately past the sentiment. This allows me some leeway when picking where to die cut my hill. I chose a die from Lawn Fawn Hillside Border die set, and I'll line that up to where I want my sentiment to fall on my card. And once I'm happy with the placement, I'll run it through the die cut machine. Now that I have the structure of my hill, I'll come in with some Distress ink Lucky Clover, and I'm focusing the ink to the middle of the die cut and to the bottom of the die cut. This is to emulate the effect of shadow. And to add a little bit more variation in the color, I'll add a little bit of Evergreen Bough, again, focusing the color to the middle of the die cut to the bottom. And finally, I'll add some Twisted Citron, and I'll add this to the very top of the die cut to add some highlight. Next, to find the placement of the sun. And to find the placement, I'll bring in the hill because I know that I want the sun to be rising over the hill. To create the sun, I chose a stencil from Simon Says Stamp Stencil Circle Mask. Once I have the placement of the sun, I'll tape that down, remove the hill die cut, and begin to ink up my sun. I'll start off today with Distress Ink Mustard Seed, focusing that in the middle. I'll then add in some fossilized amber, focusing that on the outer edge of the sun, followed by carved pumpkin, again focusing it to the outside, and finally spiced marmalade. I came in a little bit too heavy-handed with the orange tone, so I'll bring some mustard seed back in. With the sun in place, I'll remove that circle mask. To prevent my sun from becoming inked with other colors, I chose the corresponding circle mask and taped it over the sun with a piece of rolled up washi tape. And to start, I'll use some fossilized amber just to soften the edges of the sun. To emulate a really pretty sunrise, I'll bring in some picked raspberry, wilted violet, and salty ocean. Before I move on, I want to make sure that the sky is reaching below the hill that I die cut. And the edge of the sun was still a little bit too harsh for me, so using a mini blending tool, I'll blend out the edge of the sun with some fossilized amber just to create some softness. Compared to the sun, I felt that the sky was a little bit too unsaturated, so off camera, I'll just go ahead and saturate the rest of the sky using the same colors. I wanted to add some dimension by bringing in another hill, and just using the same piece of paper that I cut my initial hill, I'll add some more ink, and using the same die, I'll cut a hill for the background. For the background hill, I'm using a saturated Mode Lawn Distress ink, making sure that it's darker. The darker color emulates the shadow that would be seen in the background. I'll run that through the die cut machine. Now, since I used the same die to cut both hills, the angles are the same. And just to add some variation, I'll tilt the hill in the background to change that angle. Now that I'm happy with the color of my sky and the placement of the hills, I'll go ahead and glue that down. It's okay to glue the background hill down completely. For the hill in the foreground, you want to make sure that you don't glue down the top of the hill, not yet. And with a pair of scissors, I'll just go ahead and trim off the excess pieces of the hill. I want my final card to be an A2 card size, and I know that I want this card to have a bit of a mat, so I'll go ahead and cut down this card front using the largest die from Fawn Outside In Stitched Rectangle Stackable Set, and I'll run that through my die cut machine. The next element I'll create is my Cheery deer, and using Vintage Photo Distress ink and Walnut Stain Distress ink, I'll ink up a portion of cardstock large enough to accommodate the Cheery deer die. On the left, I'll add some antique linen, again making sure that the colored portion is large enough to accommodate the Lawn Fawn Cheery deer die. I'll go ahead and run both colors through the die cut machine. The last thing that I need for my deer is the shadow die, and I just cut that from 110-pound white cardstock. I chose the outline of the deer that was colored in Vintage Photo and Walnut Stain, and I'll just go ahead and adhere that down with some liquid adhesive. I chose some of the elements to be colored in antique linen, the antlers, parts of the face, and the underbelly. I'll just go ahead and adhere those pieces with liquid adhesive. I went ahead and added the walnut stain pieces. I chose not to add pieces to the ears, the eyes, and the hooves. The hooves were colored in with a black alcohol ink marker. And colored the ears in with a nude alcohol ink marker. The eyes were colored in with Nouveau crystal drops in black, as well as the nose. Just to spread out the Nouveau crystal drops a bit, I'll use a seam ripper, and then I'll set that aside to dry completely. While that dries, with a Fine Tech Gold pearlescent watercolor paints, I'll create a swatch just on a piece of scrap piece of paper, and I'll set that aside to dry. Using a fairly dry brush, I'll just add some of the excess paint onto the deer. I want to be careful not to add too much water to the deer, as distress inks and distress oxide inks are water reactive and it will impact the coloring on the deer. Now that my little swatch is dry, I'll use Simon Says stamp Let's Celebrate dies to die cut 3 balloons. And to those balloons, I'll attach some silver thread. I'll attach the silver thread by tying a knot and tying it taut around the base of the balloon. I'll then secure the knot with some liquid adhesive. I started initially with Tombow clear liquid adhesive, but chose to switch to a super glue. And I just want to make sure that that string is pressed nicely into that pile of adhesive. And to do that, I'll just use a paper piercer. I'll be generous with the amount of string for the tail. Once I have all the balloons secured, I'll tie 2 knots in the front for aesthetics. Before I place down my balloons, I want to make sure that I have the placement of my deer, so I'll go ahead and glue it down. I'll then cut off the shorter tail of the balloon and find my placement pulling the strings down towards the hill. Once I have the placement of my balloons, I don't want to pick them up to glue them down. I'll first dab some glue under the first balloon just to create a bit of a guide. And once I have that guide in place, I'm free to pick up the other balloons to add adhesive. I have 3 balloons in my balloon bunch, so for the bow, I'll cut 3 strings, and I'm giving myself lots of length to create the bow and also play with the length of the bow as well as the tails. I'll tie the bow around the strings secured to the balloons, and I did find this part to be a little bit fussy. I'm using a paper piercer to ensure that I don't pull the bow loops shorter than I want them. And holding those loops in place, I'm free to pull on the strings without fear of wrecking the bow. Once I'm happy with the bow, I'll need to hide the infrastructure. I'll place some liquid adhesive behind the top of the hill and tuck the strings that are attached to the balloon behind the hill. Once those strings are secure, I'll go ahead and trim the tails. And glue the remaining top of the hill to the card front. I still want to make sure that my bow is secure, so I'll secure that down using some liquid adhesive, and I'll place that under the bow to secure it not only to the card front, but to secure the knot of the bow as well. And once that bow is secure, I'm free to go ahead and trim the tails of the bow. Using 2 rectangle dies, I'll create a frame. One is from Fawn Large Stitched Rectangle Stackables die, and the inner rectangle is from Fawn Outside In Stitched Rectangles Stackables set. And I'll create a frame out of metallic cardstock. Once I run that through the die cut machine, I'll adhere the frame to the card front using liquid adhesive. I chose to add a sentiment to the inside of my card, and the sentiment that I chose is from Simon Says Stamp Let's Celebrate Stamps and Die Set. I'll pick that up with my stamping tool and add some Versamark ink. And I'll emboss that using Recollections Detail Gold Embossing Powder. And after I've removed the excess, I'll set that with the heat tool. And the final thing to do is to add our card front to the card base. I'll do that using liquid adhesive. And that completes today's card. Thank you so much for stopping by. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.